Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor Podcast. I'm Kim Scott.
I'm Amy Sandler, and today we are really excited to welcome Kieran Snyder to the podcast. Kieran is founder of Nerd Processor, a research and consulting firm with a pretty fabulous name, chief scientist emeritus, and co-founder of Textio. Kieran is a longtime software product leader, accomplished data writer, leadership coach, recovering academic with a PhD in linguistics. I can't even say that. A PhD in linguistics and cognitive science from the University of Pennsylvania. And today we're going to be talking about with Kieran an experiment that you did to determine the age-old, or at least COVID-old question, are in-person or remote meetings more inclusive? So welcome, Kieran.
Thank you. I'm so excited. Kim, this is our first time chatting in a while, and I'm so excited to be talking about all the meetings stuff today. I'm happy to be here.
I'm always thrilled to chat with you. I became aware of you, Kieran, long before I met you. I was the coaching at Twitter, and your article about the abrasive trap that women fall into made the rounds. It was the longest email thread at Twitter ever, internal email thread. It struck a nerve for me and for just about everyone else there. So admire what you do with Textio, what you created there, and love what's coming out of Nerd Processor. So great admirer of your work.
Thank you. That means so much, Kim, coming from you, because it is all mutual. I was thinking about how we first met, and I couldn't remember, but I remember when the two of us were having a conversation last year with Aileen Lee. She took credit for having introduced us. So I'm willing to give her credit.
Let's
think that's maybe how it happened.
It probably did at one of her parties. I remember sending you a fangirl email at some point, and she probably gave me your email address. So there you go.
History was made.
Yes.
Well, I love the backstory. Before we get into meetings, Kim, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask, because it's on my mind and I suspect some of our listeners. Kieran, can you describe this abrasive trap of which Kim speaks that inspired such a lengthy email thread?
Well, but before I co-founded Textio, which is a software company, right, that is really all about helping people write fairer feedback in various workplace settings. I've been looking at workplace communication on the research front for a long time. I was a software person for a really long time at Microsoft and a little bit at Amazon. And I got really interested in the ways that women were judged differently than men, as far as I could tell anecdotally, for how they communicated at work. And because my training is really in empirical linguistics, instead of just looking at the anecdote, I wanted to collect some data to get beyond that. And so in 2014, shortly before we started Textio, I collected a bunch of performance reviews from strangers on the internet, which is still miraculous to me that hundreds of people were willing to send me their performance reviews. But I was betting at the time that the only people who would be willing to do that would be high performers, the people who were willing to share their review. And that was true. The people who shared their reviews were quite positive in their reviews. And I wanted to look at the differences between how high-performing women were described compared to the rest of the organization. And the abrasiveness trap was the title of the article in Fortune that I wrote when I unveiled the findings, because women were significantly more likely to be described as abrasive, among other things. I think when I went back and looked at that data recently, we just at Textio just published our annual feedback research. It's the 10-year anniversary of that very first abrasiveness trap piece. And at the time, we found that 88% of those high-performing women were receiving feedback about their personality rather than their work. Good, bad, ugly, whereas only 12% of the high-performing men were.
Wow.
So that really started a decade of research on the topic.
Yeah, and basically the idea is that a woman is told she can't be promoted or she's getting a low rating because she's too abrasive, whereas a man is like aggressive, but he's got to be to get the job done. Is that basically?
Exactly.
Maybe not exactly with that tone of voice, but
approximately, though, with that tone of voice. That tone of voice and hearing it a lot is what led me to get real data about the problem.
Yeah. And if I'm hearing you, Kieran, I mean, it really reinforces what we do at Radical Candor, which is wanting our feedback to be framed around observable behavior or actual work product rather than about personality. Is that sort of the guidance that comes out of the data from your perspective, that it's actionable feedback rather than personality based?
Yes, I feel like the data philosophically aligns beautifully with the Radical Candor framework. That's why I've always been a fan of the work that you all do at Radical Candor. Because most people, when push comes to shove, give feedback in alignment with their decades of lived experience and the bias that has created, over time, rather than with what we might call best practices. And so this is never ending education for people. I think it's software for people, but there's so much work to be done because whatever tools we create, we are combating literally people's entire lives of lived experience and what that has created and how we like to talk about women in the workplace. I will say, like, one of the things really on my mind right now this year, with all the research I've done this year, I have collected so much data that I wasn't looking for, showing the ways that women aren't necessarily better than men are when they label women at work, that women sometimes do undermine women. And I'm really struggling with how to present all that data because I don't want to present that data in a way that is itself misogynist or undermining of women at work. But the data is there. We all have stuff to learn.
Yeah. I mean, women can be just as sexist towards each other as men are, unfortunately.
For sure. And true across races, across age groups, across cultures. So there's so much it's a lifetime of research, though. Never boring.
And I think also part of the issue is not necessarily gender, but power, right? And part of the issue is that women often have less power than men, and so they don't always fall into the problems that one has when one has too much power. Like, you had some other research that was very interesting, that the people who interrupt the most often are not men, but women with power.
Yeah, actually, I'm really glad you brought that up. I think that's a super point. Around the same time, I published some research on workplace interruptions in meetings and found exactly that women were more interrupted by men and women than anybody else. And of course, less senior people were interrupted by more senior people, but the biggest interrupters of all tended to be the most senior women. I actually refreshed some of that research this year. I collected a huge new corpus. I now have 1,100 hours of recorded meetings across more than 150 organizations. And I looked specifically at hybrid meetings in this case because I wanted to see, the sort of I'll call it like the toxic setting where everybody's in the room except one person who happens to be the one kind of stuck virtual.
Yeah.
And in that setting, the only person, regardless of gender, regardless of race, the only person who can get a word in when they are remote is the boss. If the person on the phone is the boss, they can interrupt, they can cut in. And otherwise nobody is able to. It's like really, really striking data. So power does end up being such an important factor in all of this.
So I want to double click on that. And Amy, it looked like you had a thought too. So lest I interrupt you.
No, well, you were in the same. I have so many thoughts, but Kim, just since I know we've got all this empirical research from Kieran, I thought I would ask you, as a self-defined inveterate interrupter, like, what, from your perspective, like, what is underneath your interrupting from your own experience?
Well, it's obviously because I'm so powerful. I did not get told that I interrupted earlier in my career. I got told later in my career, after I did, in fact, have more authority in the room. And I've rarely been told by my boss that I interrupt them. I've been told by employees that I interrupt them. So, and this is something that is really, it's so hard to learn, I think, because I think of myself as a person who tries to include others, and I think of myself as a good listener and not a bully. And yet it's so easy to make all those mistakes when you have a little bit of power in the situation. Power corrupts, even the best of us.
First of all, I really appreciate you saying that. I think it's really helpful. I also wonder, at least my side of when I experience sometimes if you're interrupting or moving onto a point, it is because as the leader in certain meetings I might be in, you want to get stuff done. Like you want to get to an outcome. And so there's that like efficiency. And from my perspective, I feel like the interrupting is not always about power. It may be about your desire to get to an outcome more efficiently. It's not about power so much as like wanting to get to a decision or an outcome.
Yes, I think that's right. But I also have that feeling when I'm the least powerful person in the room, but I'm less likely.
You're less likely to act on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a big time interrupter and have been forever. And unlike Kim, I have heard this my entire career and in my entire personal life. And let's go way back. And I come from a family of nonstop interrupters. It's just our internal family culture. It's how we communicate. And we don't take interruptions as annoying most of the time until I had a kid who hates being interrupted. Hates it. And anytime I interrupt her doing my yes and sort of building, she'll stop. She'll be like, okay, do you think I could go now? No, you're right. Right. But I think a lot of it is, we don't think of it as power. And, Amy, you called it maybe efficiency. But the kind of person who feels frustrated by quote unquote inefficient conversation often has jumped to a conclusion about where the conversation is supposed to end up. And that is a kind of power, right? That is in fact I've already done the work. I've thought through all of this. I could save us all a lot of time here. Let me just say the thing. And that is inherently like a power move, right? And of course, it's not always the most open-minded move or the most collaborative move. It's, open-mindedness is inefficient. It doesn't mean that it's the wrong thing to do. So
yes,
it's tricky.
Yeah. It's so interesting, Kieran, because I did not come from a family of interrupters. I grew up because I can't blame my family dynamic. Like I grew up as a woman in this, or as a girl in the South, and I was really taught never to interrupt. So I'm afraid I learned it later. Probably learned it at business school, where if you didn't interrupt, you'd get a bad grade, and I was very focused on getting good grades.
Well, my data shows that your career advanced probably partly because you learned to do that, right? I mean, when you see a pattern where the most senior women in the room are the biggest interrupters of all, it's not necessarily a positive thing, but it's like the women who are able to punch through the numerous glass ceilings that they encounter along the way are often those who statistically have learned to interrupt, because otherwise you may not get your point heard. Right. If you wait your turn, you may not get one. And so that makes it really hard to wait your turn if you want to turn.
Yes. I think as a woman, you have to interrupt the interruption. There's a cartoon in Radical Respect. Don't interrupt me while I'm interrupting you, and a man saying to a woman in a bullhorn. And I think you do as you move forward in your career have to learn how to interrupt the interruptions. And it's easier, by the way, to learn how to do that when you have people who work for you who have less power than you, who still interrupt you. And so who knows? I mean, we could go on endlessly about why this happens and how it emerges, but it's really interesting.
It is really interesting. I will say, and then I want to move on to inclusive meetings. Just, I think one of the things Kim and I have talked a lot about is that we do have very different styles. And even Kim, in your book about loud listening versus quiet listening. And my tendency is really more about asking questions and leaving space for listening. And I get very frustrated if I feel interrupted. And Kim has a different style. And so we've had to even just navigate that amongst ourselves. So in my mind, sometimes it's even like less about gender and more about styles of communication that are more or less accepted in the workplace, of like what a strong communication presence looks like. First of all, we can agree that as sort of disunited, ununited as we might be, there's one thing that can rally everyone together, and that is like a shared loathing for meetings. Do you think that's like an accurate statement? We all seem to, hate meetings. And you look a lot at meetings, and one of your experiments was trying to explore which type of meeting, remote or in person, led to more inclusion. You'd mentioned hybrid, but was that not part of this study? It was just looking at two types of meetings?
Yeah, in this case, I really tried to get to a controlled apples to apples data set. So I looked at 100 hours of everybody in the same room meetings and 100 hours of everybody remote meetings. In those remote settings, I only chose meetings where all cameras were on, which, by the way, I'm certain changes participation rates, although I haven't written anything about that yet. The intuition there is super backed by the data that I've looked at, which is that cameras off, you tend to participate less. But I wanted really just to kind of control that. And by the way, I did start out collecting all this meeting data specifically to revisit the interruptions research. And then, of course, when you have 1,100 hours of meeting data, it's a trove of fun. It's like a research playground. So I got really interested in this, remote versus in-person setting, because of course everybody's interested in it. We're all workers right now who have worked in a variety of settings. When I was a CEO pre-pandemic of Textio, we had religion around co-location. Like Jensen, who's Textio's current CEO, and I really, really believed that co-location helped to create organic moments of communication, collaboration. I still think that's true.
By co-location, you mean in person?
Everybody in person in the same space. If not every minute of every day, then like a lot of the time. We were a tech company, so we were never every minute of every day. People had some flexibility. But then obviously with the pandemic, we, like many organizations, went distributed literally overnight. And we felt like we didn't lose too much productivity. And my strong feeling at that time was like, okay, I get the benefits of in-person. I get the benefits of remote. Not so sure about this hybrid thing, because it feels then like you create a weird inequity situation where some people are always in the room and some people are not. So anyway, I got really interested in it, and it's really fun to not be the CEO this year. So I can just look at the data and I don't have to convince an organization of people to do something or other. I can just be like, all right, here you all, business leaders, take the data, do with it what you will. But yeah, that's how I got started on this.
Cool.
And what'd you find?
Yeah. Tell us, what are some of the highlights?
Well, this was not, some of it was intuitive, some of it was not intuitive. So I looked at meetings that had between 2 and 10 participants, because I wanted to not just look at in-person versus remote, but I suspected, and again, not surprising, that meeting size would make a difference too. So in a 2-person meeting, guess what? Whatever the setting is, 100% of people participate, because if not, right, someone's just monologuing. And by the way, I should say participation for me had to be meaningful. So if you just popped into a meeting and said, hey, how was your weekend, before the meeting started, that did not count as participation for me. It had to be some substantive contribution to the meeting agenda. So just basic pleasantries did not count. So no surprise, I found overall participation rates went down as meetings got larger. That's what I expected to find, that when you have 9 or 10 people in the room, virtual or in person, you start seeing communication or participation rates drop off.
So in other words, let me just make sure I understand that. So in other words, 3% of the people in a 10-person meeting do 80% of the talking, and the rest are listening.
That's the idea.
Or sitting there not listening.
Yeah, I mean, by the way,
sitting there wondering why the hell they're there.
I do think there's a whole other level that I didn't try to code, which is there are people who are present without speaking, and there are people who are distracted and not really present. They're present in body only, and I didn't try to disaggregate that here. But even in this this sort of controlled place, if you think of like a 9 or 10 person meeting, by the time the in-person meeting has this many attendees, only 55% of them are participating. So you already, even in person, see nearly half the group typically drop off. But in a remote meeting, it's only a third of people participating.
Wow.
So the drop off is steeper in the all remote setting than it was, with the all in person setting. And the gap gets wider as the meeting gets larger. So two people,
what do you think? What do you think is happening there, Kieran, in terms of like the engagement more in person versus remote with the larger meeting?
I think the barrier to participate can feel higher in a remote meeting, especially the longer you've been quiet, because you have to physically come off mute. Let's go back to that data point I just shared about who can interrupt in a hybrid setting, and we apply a little of that here. It maybe feels already in an in-person meeting a little hard to cut in when there's 10 people and you haven't talked much. But in a remote setting, when you have 2 or 3 people going back and forth, the barrier to entry feels pretty high. And the longer you've been quiet, the more disruptive it might feel to you to put your voice forward. I'm going to come off mute. I'm going to say something now after 42 minutes of not. Of course, we know, like from Susan Cain's research and more, that when people do that, actually they are more likely to get listened to, because when quiet people speak up, it's like, oh, this person now has really something important to say. But I do think that feels can feel a little bit intimidating. But the thing that struck me the most, because I always look at this in terms of demographics too, is that this sort of chilling effect of these remote meetings was even worse for women's participation than it was for men's participation. I didn't have quite enough data to look at non-binary people in this data set, so I put that aside. Race, by the way, did not matter, to my surprise. I did look at race in this data set. I expected it would. But this was really striking. So, and again, the bigger the meeting, the greater the impact on women's participation rates, even compared to men. So when a meeting had, I think it was like 4 or 5 people, you only saw women participating, 5% less than men on average. They were still, participating at relatively even rates. But by the time, again, you get to like those 9 or 10, you see women participating 30 to 40% less than men. And already remember, men are participating less than they were.
Yeah. So
in person.
less than in person. When you say less, women
Yes.
in a Zoom meeting or a virtual meeting participate 30 to 40% less in a meeting that's 10 people.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So you get all these interesting compounding effects. Like the bigger the meeting, the lower participation rates. When our meeting is remote, you lower participation rates. And when those participants are women, by the way, even in an all women's meeting, you see fewer people. Yeah, that's the really interesting thing, because I tried to control for different mixes of participants as well. Women's participation rates still greater in the remote setting.
Could you control for power?
I did have some data about org hierarchy, which and org hierarchy does make some difference in this data, but not enough to fully confound the finding about gender. So, yeah.
Kieran, it's really interesting because, for us as Radical Candor, having shifted from doing all these events in person and then transitioning to a lot of, Zoom workshops and keynotes, and then now this mix of summer in person, one of the things that I've observed is really enjoying, say, in a Zoom workshop, that you can have chat or use polls. So even though you're missing out on like the in-person connectivity, there's kind of this other, seemingly, at least from my experience, like sort of less friction way for people to engage, like through chat rather than speaking. And so I don't know, in your research, were you able to look at that, or is it really just people speaking versus not speaking in a virtual setting?
Yeah, it's a really astute observation about chat. I haven't analyzed that yet. I do have the data, and it's on my research.
Cool.
It's on my research list. And I'm curious if you see the offset, if women's participation rates decline, are they more likely to be using chat more often, or do you see chat used more often as the meeting size gets larger, which anecdotally, I think you do.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll note that complicates this just a little is I have found a lot of organizations have, if not rules, then I'll say strong norms and guidelines about the use of chat in their virtual meetings. So there are organizations that embrace it and welcome it as a way to make sure you get your ideas without actually interrupting the person who's speaking. But I've also worked with organizations that really frown on it because it can be distracting from being present in the main conversation. If people are focused on typing and reading, it's harder for them to listen to what's being said. So I have to figure out how to disaggregate the org norms, because I think that's going to be a factor here. But it's a great observation.
Yeah, just from my own experience, so I'll be super curious to see that. The other thing that was popping up as you were sharing the data was around this idea of when we're in person, we, it's sort of harder to be doing other stuff or to be distracted. So to your point of knowing, is somebody not saying anything in present, or does the virtual meeting enable people? I've got so many meetings and now this is my chance to be doing the work. It sounded like these meetings were required to be cameras on. Did I hear that correctly?
I don't know if they were required to be cameras on, but I selected meetings that had all participants with cameras on. So I'm not sure of the backstory in each individual meeting, if it was like a mandate or just the way they work.
I wonder if part of it, here's a hypothesis, is that so let's assume that women are more likely to be interrupted when they try to participate than men. I think the data is pretty clear that happens more often, both over Zoom and in person. I think that it's a little bit harder to interrupt the interruption. Let's all try to interrupt each other right now. Whereas if we're in
what you're saying, Kim, is that it's hard to
interrupt.
Karen,
Let's turn all these squares purple at the same time. It's a little harder to break in, just technically, because there's a tiny little bit of lag. I wonder to the extent to which the medium makes it a little harder, or if there's something else going on. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's possible, but can I give you a different but related data point?
Yeah.
Something else from the big meeting corpus of fun this year. One of the other things I wanted to look at side by side with this was the phenomenon, I call it idea annexation. So this is where, maybe we're having a conversation, Amy makes an observation, no one hears it. 5 minutes later, I say the same thing, and the whole
great
group
idea,
is like,
Kieran.
Yeah, whoa, I've never heard of that before.
That's never happened to me, Kieran.
Well, I wanted to see who, and by the way, I think I will say there's another pattern that is a little more virtuous that I also looked at in the data called idea spotlighting, which is the conversation moves on. 5 minutes later, I say, hey, I think Amy made a really interesting point 5 minutes ago. Amy, would you mind repeating that? Because I think it's really pertinent, right? So I think there's a couple of ways to grab a prior idea and resurface. One is more benevolent than the other. And the one that's not benevolent is usually not conscious, I'm sure, in most of the time. But the stereotype here is also that, women are constantly having this done to them and men are constantly doing this. And when I looked in the data, men and women were both more likely to take credit than they were to give it. So most of us are credit takers, not credit givers. And in general, it is nearly always women's ideas who are taken. But men are not necessarily taking them more than women are in the same room. So I think when let me see if I can pull up the data. So when a man is repeating a woman's ideas, he's giving the woman credit 13% of the time. When a woman is repeating a woman's ideas, she's giving the woman credit 29% of the time. So it is more, and it is significantly more, but it's not a lot.
Yeah, it's both. Yeah, it's bad.
Right.
Both.
And so I mentioned this because, Kim, going back to your question, is there something about the difficulty of cutting in? I think when you have a pattern like this, and by the way, this data applied across meeting settings. The credit taking, when you cut in, are you even likely to be heard?
Yes.
Right. And so that if the answer is you're not likely to be heard, the effort of cutting in starts feeling like the trade-off's just not worth it.
The ROI is not good.
Exactly.
Yeah. So interesting.
And just to amplify that one, Kieran, that you were talking about that there could be an ally piece of this, of spotlighting. Oh, well, as Kieran mentioned, when people repeat back what they said, that's a way to amplify it. Kim, I'm thinking of, I think it was your conversation with Matt Abrams of Think Fast, Talk Smart, where one of the ways that we can engage, especially if we're maybe more introverted, is repeating back what we heard. And maybe that's an opportunity to amplify, oh, Kim, like you said this or that. So I'm curious from both of your perspectives from an inclusion piece of it, would that be a tip that people would want to walk away from this podcast with of idea spotlighting? Is that something that would be helpful for people to do in meetings?
I think yes.
Kieran?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It counts on you really being a good enough listener that you notice the thing that other people aren't crediting. But I do think that's a wonderful act of allyship, because it's you using your relatively louder voice to give credit to somebody who is having a tough time being heard in the meeting.
It's also good for you. I mean, it's good for other people, but that's often a way that I try to not interrupt, is I try to focus on listening and then midway through the meeting, summarizing where I think we are. And maybe I have something to add, or maybe I don't. But I try to not jump right in. I mean, I've already failed in this conversation, but I try not to. I try anyway. Yes, that was advice given to me by one of my bosses before I went to business school. He said, listen for the first half, at least, of the class. Don't talk too soon. Listen, and then summarize where the conversation is going, and then maybe try to turn it in a different direction if you have an idea that adds to the conversation.
One other data point I'll share, because it's all the stuff is so interrelated. One of the other things I looked at is who says "I told you so" in meetings. And there's, by the way, lots of ways to say "I told you so."
Is that per my last email, like "I told you so," or is that
just like I predicted, just as I, I was right. I told you this would happen. I already pointed this out, and there's a lot of ways to say this. But this data, I think, of all the meeting data for me, was the most interesting this year, and a little bit surprising. Both men and women were more likely to say "I told you so" to people of their own gender. So I expected from all this other data that everybody would be saying "I told you so" to women, but that did not turn out to be the case in the data set. So when women are saying "I told you so," 87% of the time it is to other women. When men are saying "I told you so," 73% of the time it's to other men.
Wow.
So again, it's a little less strong of an effect around gender for the men than the women, but there's clearly an effect. And by the way, we say this so often in meetings. Like, this comes up so often. When I looked at the core data, this was coming up several times per hour from the collective.
I told you so was
the equivalent, or a variety of similar expressions of like, "Yep, I said this. I knew this would happen. That's what I said."
So interesting.
Yeah, well, and to me, it like this that piece alone is so fascinating to me, Kieran, because I'm just putting myself into that story and thinking like the reasons why somebody might say it, because somebody might be saying it because they're back to that frustrated, like they've been saying this and nobody's heard it, and then finally like it's become a topic, or they could be saying it because they want the credit, and so I don't know how you can measure sort of the motivations underneath that, or to Kim's point about layering in the power, but anything popping up for you about like the why underneath the "I told you so"?
So unlike the other data, in this data, I looked at some factors that did matter in addition to gender. One of them was race, and there was a difference and an effect here by race, which is most notably white people and Black people say "I told you so" more than other races. And East Asian people say "I told you so" much less than other races, which suggests there's some cultural component here to, you know, the norms around it being okay. But the most interesting thing in all of this data to me was that software engineers, I looked by role for this particular pattern, say "I told you so." By the way, all races, all genders. Software engineers say "I told you so" 7 times more often than everybody else.
I think we just found our clip from this podcast.
It was really striking. 7.5 times. And
Wow.
I think so, Amy, going back to your motivations, when you listen to a lot of these cases, and I cross-check this with many software engineers that are near and dear to me.
We're both
a lot
married
of it
to software engineers, right?
Isn't about necessarily proving that I was right. By the way, I was a software engineer, so like I get this.
Also one.
Yeah, I know that of which I speak. But a lot of it is about precision, and wanting to, and software engineers are also more likely to say "you told me so." Like,
okay.
just
Well,
as
maybe
you said,
they're more hypothesis, observation, conclusion. They're testing.
Exactly.
It's a way they're constantly testing a hypothesis, and either the
Yes.
hypothesis was true or not true, and that's interesting.
yes, not 7.5 times more likely to say "you told me so," but 2.5 times more likely than everybody else. So, but like, I think there is a real cultural component around "I told you so," which is, am I grandstanding, or am I really trying to get to the bottom of how we got here so that we can learn from it, for the future? And so I thought there were a lot of really interesting, I want to pull at the thread of this one a little more in the research, because I think there's a lot here around culture.
Well, that one is fascinating.
Yeah, totally interesting. This is such important research because there's so much data that shows when everybody speaks roughly the same amount that you get a better outcome from a team, right? So it's so one idea for those of us who have a lot of virtual meetings who are not in person is using. There's a report, I think, like in Otter AI and most of the note-taking apps that you can elevate, that says what percentage of the time in the meeting you spoke. And I think it would be interesting to look at that more often. I'm going to try to start. I'm going to take an action to try to start looking at that more often. What percentage of time in a meeting did I speak?
Yeah, I think that's great. A lot of the meeting tools now have that encoded. But Amy, I like what you said. If you were leaving with like one practical tip, the idea spotlighting tip is going to captures active listening, because you can't do that unless you're actively listening. It helps you build relationships with people who maybe will be really appreciative that you're able to help their voice, cut through. If you're surfacing ideas that otherwise aren't getting heard, you're probably getting to better business outcomes, right? To the point of, you actually want to hear all the ideas on the table. If you think people are worth having on your team, it's probably worth hearing what they have to say. Right?
I used to joke when I was at Google that they hired the smartest people in the world and told them to sit down and shut up. That's how it felt sometimes.
Well,
it's true.
And Kieran, just to go back to that, what I was curious about is, I love this idea of like tips for the listeners. So one of Kim's tips was around, looking at how much I'm speaking or not speaking in a meeting, and especially if you've got some power, to lay the minutes down, I guess is another way to put it. Idea spotlighting, Kieran, like you're just talking about. And then for folks that are thinking about meeting planning, because this is all in a context of people feeling overall just how frustrated with the amount of meetings. There's data suggesting that 70% of meetings are preventing people completing their work. And we'll put in the show notes that there's an article in the Harvard Business Review. 92% of employees consider meetings costly and unproductive. So I'm just curious, like when you think about even there's something about that number of people in the meeting, like it starts getting to 9 and 10 and we're sort of less efficient. So I don't know if you have any just guidance about meetings writ large and actually beyond just in-person versus remote. Like, is there something about just size of meetings, or is that like a future area of research for you?
I mean, there does seem to be, especially in the remote setting, there does seem to be a tipping point beyond which you almost no matter what you do, you will not get broad participation. And there's just, again, it's something about the difficulty of cutting in. Once you get above 5 people, 6 people, it starts getting difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the interesting thing is that, which demographics fall off fastest in that participation rate. But with anyone in the room, you do see that chilling effect. The other thing I haven't talked about in this research, because I'm still kind of puzzling through it, is structured agendas do make a difference. So the more structured your agenda, if you're taking responsibility as the meeting facilitator, you obviously have a really important leadership role to play in how participation works in your conversation. And more broadly, how participation works in your project. And participating in a meeting is just one vector that people have for participating in a project, right? And so I do think there's an element around meeting structure that can make a difference. And the trick is what happens when the facilitator is not very good and you're still in the meeting. What role can you play then to help, right? Because I think we've all been in those meetings too, where like it could be great, but the person leading it is struggling a little bit. How do you support, the group in that setting? I like this. I use this metaphor sometimes of captains and coaches. Like the manager of a project, a team, a meeting is sort of theoretically like the coach. Like they're getting everyone into positions, they're asking people for their contributions, but there's usually somebody in the group who's also the captain, which is like a member of the team that holds a lot of credibility, influence. They often are a senior member of the team. I think in these sort of meeting settings, the captain can play as important a role as the coach in how the team shows up. So if you are the senior individual in a group, you get to play a really important role in making it safe for other people to contribute, which makes the team work better. And of course, only raises your own standing with the group, right? Because who doesn't want a senior colleague who makes it possible for everybody to be heard? That's a really great thing.
That's a great tip. And if you're leading the meeting, make sure that you identify that captain and ask them to play the,
yes,
that's sharing then there's a little check and balance.
Right. And I think, you think about, I'm a sports person, not everyone's a sports person, but I think the same thing exists in musical performance or in theater. It's, your composer and your virtuoso, or your director and your actor, right?
Yeah.
The metaphors exist in a bunch of different domains, but teams tend to work better when the titular head of the team and the senior influencer on the team get to be super tight, work together, share goals. And as the nominal leader of the team, you can make that happen if you share your power a little bit more explicitly sometimes.
Always good to lay that power down.
Yeah.
So last question on my side, Kieran, and then I'd love to hear what we haven't talked about. If somebody is listening to this podcast and they're thinking, okay, if I want to be inclusive and all things being equal, I could have an in-person meeting of 10 or a remote meeting of 10. Does your data suggest conclusively like do the in-person meeting? I mean, is that like how strongly do you want people to walk away from this research in terms of not just meetings, but hiring and thinking about in-person versus remote versus hybrid writ large?
Well, this is the tricky part, because hiring remotely will give you, on average, a more diverse group of people in your organization, right? So I think this is a place where the diversity data and the inclusion data do not point you in the same direction, which shows that there's really no substitute for actual thoughtful leadership, right? Because if you are hiring a distributed team, you have a greater chance of hiring a diverse group of people. You can reach more markets, you can get people with more varied life circumstances, and like that's all to the good. It's just not to the good if then your operating norms make it impossible for those people to participate. right? So I wish I could tell you, Amy, like, yes, I'm coming out strong. By the way, this is why I'm glad I'm not the CEO right now, having to take a team through it, because I can just look at the data. It's way easier. But I think it's not so clear cut. Where I ended up as a CEO here was continuing to hire a distributed team, but working pretty hard to bring people together in person at some reasonable cadence, especially for higher stakes conversations, and trying to help leaders in the organization learn techniques of facilitation remotely that would help at least label and circumvent some of these not less than inclusive patterns. But no, you're not going to hear me say in person or the highway, because there's some downsides there too.
I think also there's interesting data that at first seems like it's contradictory, but it makes sense when you think about it. Project Include data shows that there's more bias, prejudice, and bullying online than there is in person. And at the same time, Best Places to Work has gathered a lot of data that shows that people who are underrepresented prefer remote work to in-person. Now, why would you ever choose the medium where you're going to experience more bias, prejudice, and bullying? And I think the answer is, for me, I mean, this is not data. This is now Kim hypothesizing. But for me anyway, like if I'm in my own space where I feel safe, even if I do experience the frustration of biased comments in a meeting, at least when the meeting's over, I can shut my computer and scream, and which I cannot do in the office or whatever it is. There was one time when I experienced some ridiculous, I don't know whether it was bullying or bias or prejudice, but something bad going on masquerading as feedback. And I remember throwing my bike helmet against the window in the office and realizing it was time to quit. But like it's way easier, I think, to recover from those experiences if you're in your own environment where you feel safe and at home.
The other element, if you look at some of the Best Places to Work data, is that in-person communities tend to feel best if you're with people like yourself.
Yes.
And so when most environments are more rather than less homogenous, most environments are more homogenous, then the data about those environments it's more likely to show a positive experience, because you start off with less opportunity for, I guess, difference, which, has costs as well. Right. So I think there's all of this research is like an exercise in control and variable and trying to make sure you can like disaggregate. But this is why there's no one right way to lead a company. Right.
Yeah.
And I deeply believe, Amy, going back to your question about sort of, like measuring out, between these modes, and you throw hybrid in there as well, which is obviously where a lot of organizations are netting out these days. I think you can lead with your values as a leader, and people will vote with their feet. Like they will choose the work environment that feels like it best aligns to their circumstances and values. And the most important thing you can do as a leader is be like honest and clear about what your operating norms actually are. Because if you are not, if you trick people into joining your organization because they're so excited, they think there's a lively in-person culture and there isn't, or they think they can work remote 5 days and then it turns out they're not, you're not doing yourself any favors. No. You might look like you're hiring well, but those people will quit eventually. Sooner than later, probably. So the most important thing is be honest about your operating norms, pick something that you're optimizing for, and just be open about it, and let people be adults and choose where they want to work.
Well, Amy, one of the things I think that's, Kieran, yes, I agree, is make it clear. And Amy, I know we're running out of time, but I really admire the way that you conduct workshops. And I think you've learned a lot of tips and tricks about how to make sure everybody participates and is included. So do you want to share with people, if you are in a remote meeting, what do you advise that people do to make sure that it's an inclusive experience?
I think it's a great question. One thing that I try to do is I always try to be in service of the full group. And so, for example, let's say there's a participant who is asking a bunch of questions that might be just for their unique situation or taking us down a different path. I'm sensitive to the amount of time that we have. I do my best to kind of honor and acknowledge that person at the same time of kind of holding the whole group. Like I feel a responsibility for the whole group. And so I might say to that person, hey, I hear you about that question. I'm going to answer it now as best I can. It's a larger question that we might not have time. I'm happy to make myself available afterwards. And so I think there's that dance. And as any leader, you have to have that sort of one-on-one ability at the one-to-many responsibility. And that's something I take really seriously. And then also just leveraging the chat and noticing what voices I may or may not have heard and sort of building on what somebody has already said and asking it as an invitation rather than saying, tell me more about that, Kim. Like, just giving them the space to, because some people write in chat because they feel safer that way as well.
So helpful.
Great question.
So shut down the bloviating bullshitters with kindness.
With some compassion.
and give the quiet ones a voice in chat as well as...
Yeah, that you really hold responsibility to the full group. And so wherever we're putting our time, we're sort of saying what matters most.
Shut down the bloviating bullshitters with kindness, I think is your episode clip. That's it.
and
Ship it. That's ready.
All right. Well, Kieran, how can people find you if it's not at shutdownbloviatingbsers.com? Where else can they
Not
find
yet,
you?
but I'm quickly going to register that domain.
Yeah, let's go get that name. We can go in on it.
That's our new business. Nerdprocessor.com is a great place if people want to subscribe and get the weekly installment.
Which I'm loving, by the way. I get those emails. I really look forward to them.
Thank you. There's lots there and lots about executive management and all of the many painful mistakes. This is like my catharsis. It's all my painful mistakes over the years. So people can go there. Following me on LinkedIn is a great thing to do as well. I publish lots of insights there. So,
and Kieran, can you just spell your name for folks so they know how to find you on LinkedIn if they're just listening?
Absolutely, Kieran, Kieran Snyder, Snyder, and nerdprocessor.com.
Awesome. And it's spelled Nerd, even though it rhymes with word, which is awesome.
It is spelled Nerd, and it does rhyme with word.
Yeah.
That is the pun, Amy. You got it.
All right. I'm finally catching up.
PhD in linguistics, spent most of my career building word processors. I know. It's the greatest moment of my life was coming up with that domain.
It is honestly giving me just years of enjoyment. So thank you.
Thank you.
Fellow nerd. I'm a fellow nerd processor. All right. So like we say, head on over radicalcandor.com/podcast show notes for this episode. Go ahead, check out Kieran Snyder on LinkedIn, sign up for nerdprocessor.com newsletter. And of course, praise in public, criticize in private. So if you're liking what you're hearing, please do rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to your podcast. And if you've got criticism, please do email it podcast@radicalcandor.com. Bye for now.
Take care.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.